Terrific. So welcome to the 8th Annual Fulbright Distinguished Lecture. Veterans of this event will have noticed that the length of the procession seems to increase every year. You might ask, why am I in it? Well, my name's Stephen Whitefield. I'm the Fellow in Politics here in Pembroke and a Professor of Politics in the Department of International Relations. And my task is to introduce everyone else in the proceedings today. Most important, however, I need to tell you that the toilets are downstairs. And if the fire alarm goes off, it's not a drill. Please proceed out that door, turn right, follow through the fire doors, and congregate by Pure Gym. Now, the order of play will follow as follows. I'm delighted that Penny Egan will shortly say a few words about the broader Fulbright initiative in the university and our aspirations for it. Penny is the Executive Director of the UK-US Fulbright Commission, and she's been right at the heart of this initiative since its inception. We note also that the Fulbright program is in its 70th year. We hope it goes on for much longer. I also note that Penny is to retire at the end of this calendar year, so I'd like to thank her enormously for all that she's done and wish her all the best. At this point, may I also thank someone else who's been at the heart of this, another recent retiree, Andrew Seaton, who's done tremendous work for this initiative as well. Penny will be followed by Dr. Robert Easton, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Development and External Affairs, who will formally introduce our distinguished speaker. Lord Stern's talk will be followed by questions, which I will moderate. We'll aim to conclude at about 6:30, when you're all invited to join on the conversation in a reception to be held just outside of the auditorium. You will follow us out when we process out again, so let's not move too quickly. For those attending dinner, it will be called at 7:30. And at dinner, there will be a further opportunity to put questions and comments to Lord Stern over coffee, which I will again moderate. So, without further ado, Penny.
Thank you. This is a very special moment for Fulbright as we celebrate our 70th birthday of the signing of the treaty that created the US-UK Fulbright Commission. We were one of the first bilateral programs to be founded alongside commissions in Italy, France, Greece, and Belgium. It's interesting to note the other institutions and organisations celebrating 70 years of existence. In the UK, we marked the end of post-war bread rationing, the passing of the Town and Country Act that included listing buildings, the Windrush sailed in, and of course, the founding of the NHS. On the global stage, a few years earlier, the US and the UK could be seen collaborating in the shape of the Bretton Woods Conference. As we all know, out of that significant meeting were born the IMF and the World Bank, symbols of a determination to rebuild shattered post-war economies and promote international economic cooperation. With this as a backdrop, Senator Fulbright was busy persuading Congress to fund the Fulbright program. His vision was similar to the ambitions of the Bretton Woods Conference, but he saw friendship between people as the essential ingredient for creating a peaceful and prosperous world. Academic and cultural exchange became his chosen vehicle to achieve this vision. 70 years on, in different circumstances, we aim to continue to fulfill the Senator's vision. Over the past 10 years, we have substantially grown the program, creating new partnerships and new exchange initiatives. One of these has been a very productive and hugely enjoyable relationship with Pembroke. And I've been working very enjoyably with Lynn Brindley, Stephen Whitefield, and Andrew Seaton. Senator Fulbright was an alumnus of Pembroke, studying here as a Red Scholar. So some years ago, I was privy to the college's ambitions to commemorate the Senator, and together we set out to raise the profile of Pembroke's initiative to establish a permanent memorial to him in the form of an endowed chair at Pembroke and at the Department of Politics and International Relations. While this is pursued, and it's still being pursued, and I know they'd love someone to come forward with the funding, while this is pursued, the US-UK Fulbright Commission has been pleased to enable a visiting professor to spend time here. Next year, Pembroke will welcome Dr. Nazarden, a professor at Columbia University, an expert on Miriam Makeba, better known as Mama Africa. And we'd be delighted to be party to organising these 7 previous Fulbright lectures. We're grateful to all our supporters and sponsors that have included Brian Wilson, the late Roberta Foote Fulbright, Julia Destage, the Fulbright Association, represented here by John Bader, the Lois Roth Foundation, represented by Matthew Arndt. We have welcomed eminent speakers to this platform in the past years, including 2 Nobel Prize laureates, Harold Varmus and Joseph Stiglitz. The latter was tonight's speaker's predecessor at the World Bank and a great friend. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Robert Easton.
Thank you, Penny. I'm delighted to introduce Nick Stern, and actually we should probably more correctly call him Professor Lord Nicholas Stern of Brentford, to give the 8th Oxford Fulbright Lecture in International Relations. You just heard from Penny the excitement around the Fulbright programme and the deep history of the Fulbright programme and how important it is right here in Pembroke College. And I completely agree that the work that the Fulbright Commission does and the scholars do themselves is particularly important and topical right now, given where we sit transatlantically and politically. So the more we can do with good educational exchange, and I certainly hope that the Fulbright scholars and the Commission and, of course, the mighty Oxford University can have a real impact on that intercultural links that are transatlantic and have real impact at this rapid time of change. And the crucial importance of education and of interconnectedness and exchange has permeated a lot of what Nick has done historically throughout his career. And he has a truly remarkable resume. After reading maths as an undergraduate at Cambridge, he saw the light, obviously, and came here to Oxford to study for a DPhil at Nuffield and then stayed here in Oxford for 8 years. He's currently the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics, a post he's held since 2007, and he is head of the India Observatory and also chair of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and Environment, and that's at Imperial College in London. His career is glittering. He has been chief economist in 2 supranationals, the World Bank and the EBRD. In the UK government, he's headed up the economic service in the past and has also been second permanent secretary at the Treasury during Gordon Brown's tenure in number 11. He's currently Royal Economic Society president and a past president of the British Academy. He's held academic posts here in Oxford. He's currently an honorary fellow at Cats and Queens and will be granted an honorary degree actually in a few weeks' time at Insignia here in Oxford. He's also held posts in the US at MIT and in France, and on top of all of that, he has 12 honorary degrees already. He's found time, amazingly amongst all of that, to write 15 books and countless articles, actually over 100 articles, covering economic development, particularly in India and Africa, and tax reform, economies that are in transition and development, but particularly the economics of climate change. And that, I'm a scientist by background and a sort of part-time conservationist, and it's that I have the most interest in, the work that Nick has done in the past, because it has an impact across generations, but it also has an impact right here on the planet, and I'm sure he'll describe more of that later, but not just on the planet, in the atmosphere as well. And this work dates back to 2006 to the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, which, as I say, was published in 2006 and was the culmination of a big research effort at the time to assess lots of evidence on the impact of climate change and its economic costs. And this was written when times were different to today. There were a lot of naysayers around about climate change at the time. But what the review concluded was something very simple, which was that the benefits of strong and early action now would far outweigh the economic costs of actually not doing anything. Many of you remember Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and Nick's work came around about the same time as that, but was much more academically rigorous and economically relevant. One of the conclusions of the report was, of course, that climate change is required across all countries. It's a global problem, and taking action actually need not cap growth in either a developed economy or a not-so-developed economy. Which brings me back to the theme of interconnectedness and interdependencies. So Lord Stern's perspective on leadership and governance in the last century, which is the subject of tonight's lecture, which I'm sure will enlighten us on the further erosion of the old interdependencies that have gone on in the world, and hopefully point us to the development of some new and hopefully beneficial interdependencies. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Lord Stern.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising this. Thank you, Penny, and thank you to the Fulbright Commission, and congratulations for all that you have done. Thank you to Stephen and Master Lynn for everything that Pembroke has done for this occasion. And it's very nice to be back in Oxford, including seeing Proctors and Pro-Vice-Chancellors. So thank you very much. And remember, there'll be another doff at the end, so be ready. Robert, if I could just, it was a lovely, kind introduction. If I could just make one small edit. I'm chair of the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. There are 2 Grantham Institutes. And so not all of you will know that Robert is an alum of Imperial as well as Oxford. So there is indeed one at Imperial, which we are very fond of, but I'm chair of the one at the LSE. It's special for us, my wife Sue is here, to be back in Oxford. I was 8 years as a fellow of CATS and preceding a year at Nuffield, a year at Queen's, a very happy part of our life. And some special friends from that time are here tonight, so that's an important pleasure for us about this whole evening. Now, this is a sort of slightly formal lecture, as you've noticed, and so I thought I'd better write it out. So I started writing it out. And then when I got to 21,000 words, I thought, well, this may be a bit on the long side to be read, so I'm not going to read it. What I'm going to do is to give you the shorter version. I was very tempted to follow the advice of Groucho Marx. Well, it's a long version, there's a short version, why should I let you down so lightly? But it'll probably be about 50 minutes, so I'll be aiming for just 5 past the hour or so. But that written version, it should go up on the website at LSE and well, Pembroke can put it on the website, but at Fulbright during next week. And then you can find references and sources of data and things to quarrel with and so on. So it'll be there, the evidence. I'm not going to use slides. That just increases the probability you'll look at me, which of course is a pleasure. So let me then start with Bill Fulbright, because I'd never had the opportunity of meeting him, but his legacy, and this is about his legacy, was really quite remarkable. He was a great internationalist. Shortly after he died, Bill Clinton called him a citizen of the world. Bill Clinton, obviously from Arkansas, Bill Fulbright, senator from Arkansas. He called him a citizen of the world, which I think, notwithstanding what the Prime Minister has said once or twice, is a very important thing. For me, it's about common humanity. It's about the readiness to work together across borders, about things that matter, things that are important. That's what citizen of the world means. And Bill Fulbright was unambiguously, if you look at his record, exactly that. He understood, it really is the John Cleese category of blindingly obvious, but right after and towards the end of the Second World War, You'd had 2 world wars and a Great Depression in 30 years. It had to be clear that we were doing something wrong, that we weren't working together, that collaboration had to be better than what we'd experienced in the last 30 years. But of course, Bill Fulbright didn't only understand that, he understood what to do about it. And he was a member of the House in 1942, and he immediately brought in the Fulbright resolution, which encouraged the US to join the United Nations, which was founded the next year. He launched the legislation for the Fulbright program in 46. It began in 48. He was the longest serving chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He really made things happen. It wasn't just the vision and the citizenship of the world. So he worked for the creation of the UN, as Penny said, the Bretton Woods institutions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, basic pillars of the international system, which has served us so well for such a long time. And I'll give evidence that it served us well in the first part of the talk. He was alone in the Senate in voting against appropriation for the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations chaired by Senator Joseph McCarthy. He opposed the war in Vietnam. He did these things when it wasn't easy to do those things. He was on the right side of big parts of history. A bit more than on the right side, actually. He was a leader in those areas. He was a Southern segregationist. He was on the wrong side of history on civil rights. But great leaders come with great flaws. It doesn't stop them being great leaders. And he was exactly that. So Bill Fulbright thought about what could be, what we could do, what we could make happen. But he also asked the question how to deliver. And those will be the central questions of what I have to say. I'm going to be quite optimistic about what we can do, and I'll be genuinely worried about what we will do. But showing what we can do is logically prior to generating the political will to doing something. And as you do that, you also have a duty to think about how you can up the probability of making that happen. So that's sort of the big theme of what I have to say. Let me explain briefly my title, a title that I derived really from Jim Martin, who founded the Martin School here, but of course it comes from Charles Dickens. So let's begin with the first few words of Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. And what he was talking about, writing in 1859 about 1775, were the tensions within nations and the tensions between nations. And that, of course, stays with us. And much of what he said is highly resonant of where we are now. But at the same time, I'm talking about an additional tension on top of within and between nations, and that's between what we have done and what we are doing and what comes next, if you like, a tension between this generation and the ones that follow, and that's of fundamental importance. I'll argue mostly in this about climate change, but it's much more than that. It's pandemics, it's antimicrobial resistance, it's cybersecurity, it's weapons of mass destruction. But what I want to do is tell the story through something I know a bit more about than those other things. But I hope that many of the things I say about building international collaboration and delivering on international objectives would apply to those other things as well. And what I want to argue is that we have in our hands actually something that looks extremely attractive. It's the we can have a sustainable and inclusive growth story in this century, including, for example, cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, which would seem a good idea even if you've never heard about climate change. So this is a very attractive story that I'm telling, but of course the challenge is, will we do it? And if we don't really move fast in the next 2 decades, we'll be in deep, deep trouble, and that's a big part of what I have to say. A lot of the problems that we're facing come from the extraordinary success of the last 70 years in the context of those institutional structures built and championed by Bill Fulbright and his colleagues. So the problem we now face is deeply rooted in the last 70 years. Churchill did say, the farther you look back, the further forward you can see. He didn't get everything right, like India and the gold standard he got wrong, but that story, that observation, does seem to me to be helpful, particularly since the challenges we face now come so directly from the successes of the last 70 years. I'm going to talk through examples. I'll talk through the example of the international agreement, which we put together in Paris in December 2015, after a long, long period of work. I'll concentrate on those things where I was, and I hope I understand a bit, particularly with hindsight, what really happened. And then I'll talk a bit about delivery, and I'll talk about the multilateral institutions, including, of course, central ones where Bill Fulbright was involved, and the multilateral development banks, which in my view have a very powerful role, potentially, if we use them well, in delivery of the global agenda, which I'll describe, of which 2015 Paris COP21 was a part. So that's the story. I did quote from the beginning of Tale of Two Cities. Those of you will remember also the end of the Tale of Two Cities, where there was a wonderful act of altruism, and the very last page is full of optimism about the world. So he's sort of talking about coming out of the chaos and building something to last. And I'm talking about not getting into the chaos, but acting now so that it doesn't happen. So there's a certain symmetry here, but I'm not recommending that any of you go to the guillotine and offer your life up for a friend in the way that the Tale of Two Cities finishes. But I do note that it was an optimistic story. But I'm only optimistic about what we can do. The other part we have to talk about. That's what I'll be talking about today. So we look back to look forward. And I'm going to do that very fast because I want to spend most of my time on the story of building a global agenda and delivering on that global agenda. But when I began teaching in development economics, 40-some years ago, we used to talk about 80% of the world's output coming from 20% of the world's people, or income as well. Now, of course, if you look at emerging markets and developing countries, it depends a bit how you measure it, but well over half would come from the emerging market and developing countries. This world centre of gravity in terms of economics, and it's beginning in politics too, has changed dramatically. Much higher trade to GDP ratio, crude measure of interdependence between nations. And we've witnessed extraordinary change, which I'll sketch, in health and demographics and education, gender issues, environment, and so on. So that story of extraordinary success fostered by the institutions that Bill Fulbright did so much to create, is extremely important to understand because it's where we begin. And it points to the importance of that kind of action in changing what happens. So world life expectancy has gone up from, I'm going to speak deliberately in very rough terms here. In many ways, the kind of things I'm talking about are not that easy to measure, but the broad story is pretty straightforward. Life expectancy increased from about 40 in 1950 to about 70 or a bit more today. It's increased by about 5 months a year. That is quite extraordinary. Infant mortality rates down, these are global averages, from 70 per 1,000 births to well below 30. Number of children per woman, the fertility rate has gone down from about 5 to 2.5 in that period. This is remarkable change. And the world population has trebled from about 2.5 billion in 1950 to about 7.5 billion now. Fewer people meet early deaths. That's sort of a good idea. And what you can see is that extraordinary increase in population has to do with mortality rates because the fertility rates have been coming down. And the raising of life expectancy is an equalizing phenomenon. It's gone up more in the poorer countries than in the richer countries. So on that key dimension, we have a more equal world. Progress in Africa, and I won't dwell on it, it's very important. Progress in Africa less fast. For example, in that time, life expectancy would have gone up by about 20 years rather than about 30 years for the world as a whole. Still very important change, but not as fast as elsewhere. If we look at the reasons for this, broadly public action, public health in terms of water supplies, inoculation, vaccinations, education itself, increasing incomes. If you look at the reasons for that change, not all, of course, but a lot of it, public action. Education, again, very crude measure. 1950, 45% of the world's population was illiterate. Now it's about 15%. That's a quite remarkable change. Again, an equalizing phenomenon, because most of that change has occurred in emerging market and developing countries. Of course, the achievement less for girls, but it's been going up strongly then as well. Sub-Saharan Africa, still 35% illiterate, so it's been dropping very rapidly, but still not the same as elsewhere. Income per capita has grown. I mean, comparing income over a period of 70 years is quite a complicated thing, which is full of qualifications and question marks. But roughly speaking, world income per capita has grown about 2%. So income per capita has gone up by a factor of about 4 in those 70 years. World population gone up by a factor of about 3. So total income output gone up by a factor of about 12. I mean, for this argument, it doesn't matter whether it's 10 or 14. The point is that you've got intense pressure from that activity on the global commons, in large measure because that output has been produced so intensively in the use of fossil fuels. So there's a story then of quite extraordinary success, and a success that arises, not all of it, but much of it from the framework and much of it from public action. That should encourage us about our ability to influence and change the world. Poverty, switching to more distributional stories now, if you take what is in current or roughly current prices, the poverty line the World Bank uses, $1.9 a day. Poverty has dropped from order of around 70% in 1950 to about 10% now. A remarkable change. That's absolute, of course, not the relative story, but it's the absolute story. It's an extraordinary change. World income inequality, well, to the extent that incomes have grown faster in emerging market and developing countries than they have in rich countries, that's an equalizing force. Of course, what's happened within countries is not the same thing. But that big story of equalization runs through. Right? It depends where you look. There's lots of qualifications. There are lots of parts of the population are different. Lots of countries are different. But I'm trying to tell the big picture over 70 years. And it's been quite a remarkable 70-year period. The politics, the political story, well, 1950, 15% of the world's population. Again, these are very crude statistics, and they're not mine. I'm taking them from elsewhere. But the rough picture, I think, is right. 15% of the world's population was living in colonies. Of course, 1950 was after Indian independence, but before the independence of most of the other colonies, and around 30% in democracies. And now it's a very small proportion in colonies and around 50% in democracies. That's a major change. Always have to qualify the last 10, 20 years don't look so great. You know, you've had advances in populism and autocratic figures at the head of a number of nations. On the conflict front, up until a dozen or 15 years ago, it was a story of improvement with a reduction in conflicts between nations, some increase of conflicts within nations, but the numbers killed in conflict were falling. That's not been true over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly around conflict in the Middle East. The interdependent story, well, again, I have to just point to very crude statistics. They do tell a story. You know, for 30 years or so, up to the crisis, trade was growing twice as fast as income was growing. So the trade to GDP ratio would be moving up very rapidly. That's not been true for the last 10 years or so. That's been static. So in that sense, our interdependence, which had been growing so strongly, stalled. And you get a similar picture if you look at foreign direct investment. And it's very interesting that if you look now at people's attitudes to globalization, in lower and middle income countries, around 10% see it as a force for bad. In richer countries, it's a good deal more than that. France and the United States, 30% see globalization as a force for bad. So attitudes to this, not only has the integration slowed down or stalled, perhaps in some ways reversed, the attitudes to it now look very different across the world. And that, of course, matters to our anticipation of what might happen next. The environment, well, that's not been so great. The oceans have recorded a 30% increase in acidity in that, roughly in that kind of period, and they're heading for levels quite soon that we have not experienced for about 20 million years. Remember, we've been around, Homo sapiens, about 250,000 years, and basically our societies appeared in the Holocene period, which is the last 10,000 years. So oceans at acidity levels not seen for 20 million years is a deeply worrying thing, not to mention the plastics that are in them as well. Air pollution kills 9 or 10 million a year. I actually think that's an underestimate, but it's a lot of people. Carbon dioxide, CO2 concentrations were 300 parts per million in 1950 and rising at 0.5 part per million a year, and they're now 400 parts per million and rising at 2 parts per million a year. So if you look at these sort of very big picture stories of oceans, air pollution, CO2 concentrations, we're in very serious trouble. So I've looked across the whole, very fast, across a whole series of dimensions. Some things are quite extraordinarily positive in terms of human history, but because of that sheer weight of output that I described, I talked about a factor of 12, and it being so strongly from fossil fuels, this is a very intensely difficult position that we now find ourselves in. Where are we going to go from here? Well, I've more or less been implicit in the way I've described the past. Life expectancy has been going up about 5 months a year. It will probably go up about 1.5 months a year for the next several decades. It will go up, but it will slow down. Education surely will move very strongly now to most of the world. I mean, most of the world, 80-90% goes to primary school. I mean, of course, what they learn in school is a separate thing, but most of the world that goes to primary school, before long, it's going to be most of the world going to secondary school. And that's going to be a very strongly equalizing phenomenon. And we hope that the pressure, the demand for increasing quality will move strongly as well. On policies and institutions, I've already raised the question marks. I mean, the more you have populism and autocratic leadership, the more you have cronyism, the worse is the investment climate, the lower would be the quality of the investment process. And we're seeing now, as we speak, major question marks about the advance of world trade. So this is a story then of strong progress, but major question marks about how it will continue, not on all dimensions. Health and education really will move ahead, or perhaps a bit less slowly. The movement in the center of gravity of economic activity in the world will continue. And, roughly speaking, again, depends how you measure it, but India's income per capita would be about 1/3 of China's, and China's would be about 1/3 of the United States. That catch-up process has still got quite a long way to run. So finally, on the environment, where might we go? And here's the big urgency. And I spent a lot of time in China, so let me talk about the 3 doublings. The world's infrastructure will double in about 15 years. The world's economy will double in about 20. That's, roughly speaking, a growth rate 3% or so. And the cities and towns will double in 40 years. They'll move from 50% of 7.5 billion now to something like 70% of 9.5 billion in the middle of the century. Those are the 3 doublings. And, of course, those cities will be shaped by the investments in the next 20 years. The next 20 years are absolutely crucial. In that period, we've got to cut emissions by 20% if we're to have any reasonable chance of holding to 2 degrees, or the Paris well below 2 degrees. This next 20 years are of fundamental importance. They shape what happens to this century. They shape whether it's the best of centuries or the worst of centuries, and it's in our hands. We know what to do. It's very attractive, but it does involve radical change. Will we be able to do it fast enough? I hope so. It's our job to have a go. So let me then turn to the global agenda and how we deliver on that global agenda. 2015 saw the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in September, United Nations. And then in December, you had the Paris Agreement, COP21, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in December. Remember it well. 8:30, the gavel came down on December the 12th, and we all went wild. It was a nice moment. But that was quite an extraordinary achievement of that year. And both of these things took a long time coming. They didn't come out of nowhere. But they are quite remarkable. 193 countries have signed up to both of those things. It's quite remarkable how that happened, and it's important to try to understand why. And we all know that there's a lower self of narrow self-interest defined in a narrow way, the behavior around it being narrow behavior, often short-term as well. But we also see through these events, including the events that Bill Fulbright was so involved with, a better view, a higher self, or nations that want to get together around something that really counts. We saw it then in Bill Fulbright's time. We had a nice flicker and arousal, if you like, in the Millennium Development Goals, and then they were crystallized much more strongly in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. I mean, if you think about what Dickens was writing about, if you think about what Tolstoy writes about, they're talking about these two parts of humanity and nations coexisting. And what we're talking about here is how you work together to make that stronger, higher part practical and capable of delivery. We know we can do it. I mean, the history I just described shows that we can do it. The question is, will we? Well, I'll share some thoughts on it. I've begun, obviously, to share some thoughts on exactly that. The Millennium Development Goals were just a few dimensions, 7 dimensions plus an 8th, which was about partnership, around income, health, and education. There was a bit of gender and a bit of sustainability, but not all that much. And but they were a great step forward, and developing nations and aid givers coalesced around them. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17, the last one being about partnership, but they're much more explicit on sustainability, inequality, gender, cities, climate, oceans, forests, and so on. It's very interesting that in that 15-year period or so, between the end of the 90s, constructing the Millennium Development Goals, and the 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were put together, we really did understand much more deeply the pressure on the global commons. And that was a major change. And we realized with the change in structure of the world economy that we were all involved. So the Millennium Development Goals were about progress in emerging market and developing countries. The Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by everybody, apply to everybody, precisely because our understanding of how the world had changed and what was causing the pressure and how we all had to act together had deepened. Now, I'm using sustainability a lot. Let me very quickly define what we mean. Your actions are sustainable if they offer to the next generations the same kind of opportunities that you had, assuming that they behave themselves to future generations in a similar kind of way. Opportunities depend on the stocks of capital that you have available. Crudely speaking, we can talk about human capital, social capital, natural capital, and physical capital. From what I've said, I think it's pretty obvious that human capital and physical capital have been rising strongly, and natural capital has been declining strongly. I leave it with you to have a think about what's been happening to social capital. You can tell different stories. I mean, social capital is about cohesiveness of communities, governance, the functioning of institutions, and so on. And I suppose some things getting better, some things getting a lot worse. But those are, if you like, and you'll use the economist jargon of capital, those are the 4 kinds of capital. That is a way, by looking at those, we have a way of thinking about whether we're being sustainable or not. Now, the process of agreement in the I'm going to switch now not to the SDGs, but particularly to climate change, and try to tell the story about how we got the Paris Agreement. Because if we can understand that, we'll be able to understand more about how to create those kinds of shared objectives and mutual commitments, which are vital to internationalism. Now, the that whole story of getting to the Paris Agreement, COP21, right, the Conference of the Parties, number 21 in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, been going on for a long time. I've been going to all of them since 2006. It's not always the greatest way to spend a slice of December, but the first thing is that it has been a long process to get there. You have to build understanding over a long period of time. The first attempt, as it were, to getting a comprehensive agreement was COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen. It was cold, it was chaotic, it was quarrelsome, and it was all a bit depressing. But the Copenhagen Accord, which we sort of rumbled together at the last minute, did come out of that, including the 100 billion, which I was very directly involved with, commitment of flows from rich countries to poor countries by 2020. But Copenhagen Accord, notwithstanding all that chaos, it did come out, and it became, the year later in Cancun, brilliantly led by Felipe Calderón, the president of Mexico, and his foreign minister, Patricia Espinosa. That rough ideas that came out of Copenhagen became an agreement in Cancun, but not the sort of formal commitment that we saw in Paris. Paris COP21 was 6 years later. And how did that agreement come about? If you like, what was a bit different between Copenhagen and Paris? What have we learned in this 6-year period about coming together? Well, the first thing is the length of preparation. There was a 4-year run to get to Paris. It was 4 years previously in Durban that we committed to trying to get there. There was a brilliantly led COP20 in Lima, led by the environment minister, which had a lot of the text of Paris in it. So there was a long run, 4 years, and then the last year, very specific. The second, so diplomacy, period of time, transparency, inclusivity, and some choreography. For example, in Copenhagen, the idea was to get all the presidents and prime ministers together at the end. They'd all come and celebrate this wonderful agreement they'd all put together. Well, what happened, of course, was a lot of quarreling civil servants and more juniors, people couldn't resolve, and they thought, well, we'll leave it to the presidents and prime ministers to resolve it in 24 hours at the end. Well, it doesn't happen, right? But this time in Paris, I'm just giving an example. Don't put too much weight on it, but how you have to pay attention to that kind of detail. They got the president's prime minister to come at the beginning. We're going to have an agreement. I'm instructing my people to get on with it. This is really important. We've got to make it happen. So they left at the beginning of the 2 weeks with an instruction to come up with it. And of course, there was lots of interaction. So the leadership and the choreography and the diplomacy and the transparency do matter. Secondly, you've got to avoid antagonistic blocs. Now, what happened at Copenhagen is that the rich countries started drafting privately, and then they planning to offer up to the developing countries their draft. Well, it was seriously dumb. I mean, developing countries expected a stitch-up. They already thought that all this climate stuff could be a rich country device to stop them growing just when they were starting to move. It was just a misreading of the politics of the whole story. But this time round, you had Xi Jinping and Barack Obama standing up on November 2014, offering their targets a year ahead of Paris. You had what was called the High Ambition Coalition, where the small island states and the UK and others, Canada, got together across those kind of boundaries to work for stronger ambition. So you've got to avoid the antagonistic coalitions and build the positive ones. Particularly, you've got to increase understanding. That's where we as academics come in. The understanding had deepened between Copenhagen and Paris as to the huge risks of climate change. But still more importantly, in my view, was the understanding, the growing understanding, not achieved fully, but the growing understanding that growth and climate responsibility come together. They reinforce each other, that this is the growth story of the 21st century. And that changed fundamentally. It wasn't about how much are you ready to give up for all this climate stuff. Well, that's not a very persuasive way of putting questions. You have to put it that way if it's right. But actually, increasingly, we're seeing it's not right. That if you look at the dynamics of the whole story, if you look more broadly at notions of income and well-being, and you put those together, that this is a very attractive, different way of doing it. But you have to think through the dynamics. You have to build a dynamic economics, if you like. But that has increased, and a number of us worked. This was also with Felipe Calderon, with New Climate Economy Commission, which I chaired with him. We published this book or report, Better Growth, Better Climate, in 2014, ahead of the Paris. And that's just one example of our making the case. It's a good title, actually, Better Growth, Better Climate. I wish it was myself who dreamt it up. It was actually Felipe's title. But it's the right title. It gives the message. And pithy one-liners that are well-founded, we need more of. And the last thing I wanted to point to was the involvement of different levels. Cities, private sector, NGOs, they're all there in big ways in Paris. Anne Hidalgo, the great mayor of Paris, was very active there. So that's the process. The content at the heart, at the top, about half a dozen key things in the content too. The apex story, by that I mean the overarching goal, which was well below 2 degrees, best efforts to do 1.5 degrees. You could agree around the overarching goal. You only had to have the roughest of ideas about how to get there. But you could agree about the overarching goal. And once you'd done that, you had agreed on something which took collaboration to deliver. So that was a very important part of the process. So I'm just running through the content. The second thing was it was a voluntary agreement. And that was a very important, in the sense of the targets that you put for yourself, for your emissions in 2030, were your targets, voluntary targets. They were called, charming language, intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs. But it's very important. Intended, well, that's what I intend. Nationally determined, it's me that's doing the intending. And that was a very important part. That way, people tend to be much more ambitious. And what's interesting is they announce their targets, as they did actually in the Cancun agreement. People take them seriously. I mean, some take them more seriously than others, but they do take them seriously. So that was a very important move. They were a bit more formal about processes, about how you got together, how you measured, how you worked to bridge the gap between the articulated goal of well below 2 degrees and what people said they were going to do in terms of emissions. And there was a big gap there, but that was honesty. They recognized the gap, and then they had a process for getting together to ramp up the ambition. So that was the way it happened. I've tried to give a feel for the process and a feel for the content. Some of you will have noticed that there was a presidential election in the United States, those of you who keep up to date, about 18 months or so ago. And we were all in COP22 in Marrakesh the day or so after. And the result of the election was noted with some concern. But everybody stood up and said, look, we get on with it. We get on with it because it's the right thing to do, morally, and because we're understanding this growth story much better. We're going to get on with it. And country after country stood up and said exactly that. Actually, in the United States, states and cities and firms said we're still in. And the wonderful Jerry Brown will have his Global Climate Summit in September, where he's pulling together regions and cities from around the world to do exactly that. So in the sense, the world has passed the Trump test. Now, I'm not saying that this was, I think that may be the only time I'll use the name, but the world has passed that test. It doesn't mean it's easier, it's more difficult now. But it has not been destroyed, and the United States, and indeed in the G20 summit in Hamburg in July, the month after the President of the United States had announced the intention to withdraw, the rest of the members of the G20 said Paris is irreversible. That's very strong language for a G20 communique. So that is the story of the creation and the story, I mean, obviously I had to do it very fast, and how it was that the content helped and how it was that the processes helped in that story. Just one technical point, you can't announce your intention to leave the Paris Agreement for 3 years after the Paris Agreement, and then you have to give a year's notice. And if you put that together, it's the day after the next presidential election. Now let me just spend a bit of time talking about the delivery, and here I'll major on the potential of the multilateral institutions, but it's more than that. I want to talk about ideas, international collaboration. This is the last part of my talk. I want to talk about the ideas, the way in which you collaborate internationally, emphasizing the multilateral development banks, and how you create the political will. Now the first idea is, and I can't sort of, each idea I could give a lecture about, but I just want to note them, and I hope say enough that you can see what I mean. The first is the urgency and scale. I've given you the three doublings. Infrastructure, 15 years, world economy, 20 years, world city population, town and city population in 40 years. In the 20 years, you have to cut emissions by 20%. That is overwhelming. Each forecast that I've given there is pretty robust as economic forecasts go. 50% of the world population in cities now, 70% in 40 years from now. Decimal points don't matter. It's pretty clear. We know that a growth rate of around 3% doubles in 23 years. I mean, these are pretty clear, strong, robust. So you tell people, whether it's a finance minister or somebody else, say, Nick, yeah, absolutely right. That's very clear. Thank you. And then they go on as if you haven't said anything at all. Now, getting the idea of urgency across and the scale of action is absolutely fundamental. Not just the infrastructure in terms of the physical sense, of course the natural infrastructure in terms of the forests and the Sundarbans and the oceans and the soils and the grasses and so on. All that's a big part of it as well. The second thing is I want to emphasize in terms of ideas and academics is working across disciplines. Is Adam here, by the way? Can I see Adam? Hello, Adam. Adam, Robert, my predecessor, is president of the British Academy. When we were putting together this little booklet called Prospering Wisely for the British Academy, I mean, it's a good title, but I mean, you wouldn't want to immiserize stupidly. So we wrote this book, Prospering Wisely, which was a collection of quotes, ideas from different fellows of the British Academy. And Adam said he knows of no problem of any seriousness in the world for which you can avoid taking on, or for which the collaboration across all the humanities, the social sciences, the technology, the medicine, every serious problem, you're going to need really all of those things. I mean, I've already talked about the importance of Dickens and Tolstoy and understanding these different strands of our personality. I've already gone on about the economics. The role of science and technology are obviously fundamental in the kind of problems that we're dealing with. So working together is enormously important. And I mean, if you look at antimicrobial resistance and you look at a map of where it's happening, in large measure it's around pigs in China and cows in India. If you look at the density of the antimicrobial resistance, they pump in. We do it in our agriculture here too, but just in terms of the numbers. That's about how communities behave, how they use the technologies and the scientific insight that we bring to the table. Wherever you look, the mixture of all those disciplines is absolutely fundamental importance. And of course, climate change, crystal clear that you need everything right across the academic disciplines. So that's what good universities should be doing. It's what governments should be doing as they back research. And we haven't done too badly in persuading them to increase their commitment, but we've got to keep them at it. The last thing on the point of ideas, and this is just about 3 minutes for the economists, well, who I love dearly, and of course I am one, so I'm responsible. I've just finished a paper called Public Economics as if Time Matters. I mean, how would anybody do public economics as if time didn't matter? I hear you cry. Well, it's a fair cry. But what I mean, and I'll describe the kind of things I mean that we need an economics that tells us about how catastrophic, irreversible changes can happen, how instabilities work, because that's what we face. We need an economics that tells us about how the amazing dynamics of learning can happen and how it can be fostered. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago, I mean, we were doing the Stern Review a dozen years ago, that the cost of solar electricity now would be so low, that a panel would be less than 10% of the cost that it was then. Who would have thought that the car companies around the world were talking about the end of the era of the internal combustion engine? Who would have thought that the cost of storage of electricity would have crashed almost as fast as the cost of renewable generation? You know, that was 10 years ago was the iPhone. And we now have this extraordinary ability to manage demands and supplies across a whole system. That is amazing. How do you foster it? How do you put policy together to make that kind of thing more likely to happen? That's a big part of the policy story. And actually our models in economics don't get to grips enough. We've got bits, we're building, we're trying, but that's so big, but it's not so central to our subject. There are multiple obstacles, of course, to acting on climate change, market failures around R&D, around capital markets, around networks, about information, about other forms of pollution, all relevant to policy on climate change, all potentially obstacles to change. And of course, there's discounting. Read my book, Why Are We Waiting? Doesn't cost that much. It's out in paperback, MIT Press. But basically, very quickly, we discount the future for reasons which depend on ethical judgments and our view of what the future might look like. We put those together. We might discount extra resources coming along, extra benefits that come along in the future relative to now, if we think the future is going to be much better off than we are. That's in our hands. That's what we're talking about. It might be, it might not be, but we can't talk about how we're going to discount unless we also, at the same time, simultaneously, and that's the word that's relevant in economics, look at what might be the consequences of what we do. In other words, you can't divorce the discounting from the decisions that you actually take. And we know in economics about how to put things together, that one affects the other both ways. That's something which is quite normal, but we hadn't been doing it. We've been trying to take in our discounting from somewhere outside this problem. You can't do it from outside this problem. And the other really dumb thing that they try to do occasionally is pure time discounting, which is just discrimination by date of birth. So in other words, take two people absolutely identical by assumption for this argument, and the one that's born later gets a lower weight. I mean, why would you do that? Consult Aristotle and Kant and Rawls and Rousseau and Hume, or Isaiah Berlin, or whoever you like. I mean, go and read it. You can't really find a serious argument as to why you'd want to do that. Anyway, that's what I think about discounting. And it's discounting. Anybody who starts the story with what's your discount rate hasn't understood the notion of discounting and what it's based on. But there you go. I won't dwell any further on that. We have to get much better about ideas on the whole story of credibility of policy. We have to be predictably flexible. People take long-term investments, and you have to see where they're coming from. That's a very important part of the story as well. And there's much more we can do to deepen that idea in economics. So that's the first part of the deliveries, the ideas. The second part, I'm going to underline the multilateral development banks. And I'll do it with some very quick numbers. They lend about $70 billion a year. This is the World Bank and the main regional development banks. They lend about $70 billion a year. 70% or so of that is for infrastructure. Well, for a one-shot, 50 billion, one-shot capital injection, that flow of 70 billion could be doubled. It's the magic of Keynes's brilliant idea of paid-in capital and callable capital. You pay in the capital and you promise the callable capital to be called if everything falls apart on you. Well, it's never been called. And one of the reasons is that creditors always pay those banks first because they've got a reason to have a long-term relationship. So for a one-shot 50 billion, one shot, you could double that lending. You could think about the gearing ratios. You could turn over the capital stocks much more quickly. So if you've got a successful loan or equity, you can sell it on faster than they do. We could really expand their ability to lend from 70 billion up to about 200 and more billion using just the techniques I just described very quickly. If you then build up your multipliers with the private sector to around 3 or so, you could have those institutions involved in something approaching $500 billion a year of infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is currently a bit over $3 trillion and rising. That presence is enough to give the big examples that change the way we do things. Now, that is working through an institution that is built on the idea of collaborating through concrete, specific ways for a greater good. The kind of institution that Bill Fulbright supported so strongly around Bretton Woods. So you can see how to scale that up. Now, if you scale them up, you've got to think about how they work and how they are governed and so on, and all those things are important. I'm working now on the G20 so-called Eminent Persons Group, which is to make recommendations on the reform of those systems. You have to, it seems to me, also get rid of the scandalous practice of the Europe choosing the head of the IMF and the United States choosing the head of the World Bank. I mean, in the process of moving strongly, you can bring in the kind of governance reforms. I think Europe can take a lead on all these things, and this is the last part of what I want to say. 5 minutes on political will. I've spoken about ideas for delivery. I've spoken about international institutions for delivery, and now I'm closing on political will for delivery. You have to build leadership across issues, and you have to have a common understanding of issues. We're building a common understanding of pandemics, of AMR, less so on cybersecurity, but we'll have to get on with that too. I showed how building a common understanding in the case of climate change was fundamental. You have to then, on the back of those common understandings, build coalitions across nations. Now is the time, in my view, for Europe to take a lead in the reform of the MDBs, in the inclusion, for example, of India in the Security Council, championing the UN, championing rules-based trade systems, and of course, being in the vanguard on climate change and AMR. This is a fantastically important moment for Europe to take a lead. It's not all bad, governments in Europe. I spoke on the phone yesterday to Spain's new foreign minister, outstanding individual, Josep Borrell. He gets all this. It's not all going backwards. Some of it's going backwards in ways that worry us, but we have to push the right kind of argument, policies, understanding of issues. And it is possible. And now, in particular, Europe working with China and India seems to me of really fundamental importance. So building will across nations, building will across issues, across society as a whole, business leaders, cities, governments. Business leaders are really changing on many of these issues, whether it's in financial institutions or elsewhere. The wonderful Paul Polman has put in a fantastic decade, or nearly a decade, with Unilever. They get 1.8 million job applications a year. They get the best. Well, firms that get the best people coming to work for them are likely to do well. The data on the performance of public equities being higher for those who take more responsible approaches to child labour, climate change, safety, and so on, is now increasing by the day. If you act responsibly, generally you do better. If your investment advisor was caught for drunken driving, you should worry. If they're irresponsible in one area, they're quite likely to be taking bad risks elsewhere. And increasingly you're seeing that in business. You're seeing it in finance. Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure very powerfully. So you're seeing it in cities, and cities, interestingly, if you have a slightly smaller scale organisation, you might increase the probability of acting in a cohesive way, and cities are acting quite strongly. NGOs, WWF, WRI, Oxfam have all played a very powerful role. We as academics have to speak up and act. We have to do our research. I've sketched very fast the kind of areas and manner of doing research, but we have to tackle the big problems of our time. It's a great privilege being an academic. It's a great life to pursue the things that worry you and have the time to do it. I mean, you may not think this all day, every day. I guess some of you don't. But it's a privilege, and with that comes the duty to engage. And we have to do it much better, I think, than we have engaged. There are good models out there. I've lived and worked a lot in India as well as China, but look at the way in which Gandhi communicated. He didn't have social media. He didn't have access to the radio, but he really communicated. He traveled, he got out there, he spoke, and he used the newspapers. I mean, you do what you can with what you've got, and he showed what you could do. Pope Francis has been quite extraordinary, and he said, if we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. Now, you might spend a little time, I'm having a bit of trouble with the notion of creation, it doesn't quite fit with what, that doesn't matter. What he's said is clear, strong, and basically well-founded, and people understand it. And we have to get much better at doing that. We should have had a few more of you're much more likely to be treated by an immigrant than be behind one in the queue. This is the kind of way we have, but it has to be well-founded. And that's our duty, to get the work done, but also to express it in much clearer and stronger ways. We have to be much more open. I think we're not bad at openness of our universities, but that's the kind of challenge that academics have to face. So I've tried to explain why I'm optimistic about what we can do and why I worry about what we will do, but I don't want to stop with saying, oh, well, I'm a bit worried about what we will do. I've tried to describe, through the example of the Paris Agreement and what the key elements were, through the example of the role of ideas, through the example of how you can operate through multilateral institutions. I mean, I've just chosen one example, but I've tried to show that how we can translate what we can do into what we will do through active action and thinking about how this political will be created. I'm sure that Bill Fulbright would have been absolutely in the vanguard of all this. Were he here, he'd have seen it in an instant. And that's why it's such a privilege to give a legacy lecture in his honour. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely a brilliant lecture. Very much enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you kind of more psychological question, because I think Bill Fulbright, part of his genius was that he was really brilliant at understanding human psychology, and when the whole idea of bringing peace, they're sort of like helping people see that nations can turn into people, nations can turn into people with faces on, kind of, that's what it contributed to his idea of peace. That you can't really treat someone as a tribal other or objectify them once you have friends in that nation. But I think when we talk about kind of ecological aspects, and I really love the way you defined kind of sustainability as giving opportunities to the next generation, the same opportunities we have. Part of our human psychology is that we don't necessarily can have that moral empathy towards someone we don't see. So it's like, how do we help people actually engage with the whole environmental racism or ecological injustice that is happening right here, right now around us, but just because we don't see and policymakers don't really physically engage with that injustice, I feel like there is that level of detachment. So what would Fulbright say today? What kind of policy, what kind of exchange would he create, do you think?
He'd probably try to seek the right kind of language, and to speak about children and grandchildren seems to me to be perfectly reasonable, because people see the future in a more precise or concrete way, if you like, if you use that sort of language. If you ask the question, for example, in the United States, about the creation of the national parks, the idea was that there's a common heritage that you share. So it's the sort of the beauty of owning something together and the duty not to destroy. So I think you have to try and touch those chords. And of course, people really do enjoy being in the great outdoors and seeing beautiful things, and feel that there would be terrible harm in destroying those things. So I think to looking forward is to, you have to try to, we need those skills to work in terms of language, and I've said children and grandchildren, national parks. I think the moral philosophy where you chase arguments through, Aristotle and Kant and Rousseau and so on, which many of us have tried to do here, I doubt if that's going to send the blood charging through the veins on this one. It's important to us because we're trying to get our arguments right. It really does matter to try to work out what we think. But then you have to try to translate that into language that worked. Gandhi actually was quite good on that side as well. You know, he said there's more than enough in the world for people's need, but not enough for their greed. Actually, it was a bit anti-growth for my taste, but you can see, you know, that there are ways of catching people's attention on these things, and I think Pope Francis does it well, actually. So we have to learn how to do that, but it's possible.
Greg Neal, the oral historian here at Pembroke, but wearing my other hat, the editor-in-chief of the Resurgence Trust, publisher of Resurgence and Ecologist. We're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Fulbright Commission. We're also coming up to another anniversary, which I'd like you to comment on, Lord Stern, and that is of the report which talked about the limits to growth. You've just mentioned Gandhi, and your observations about that are very pertinent. But there are still those economists, and perhaps who now feel that those reports on limits to growth were actually validated. And no matter how clever we become in terms of our new technologies, and you mentioned solar panels, etc., we still have a basic problem that if we're reconciling concepts of social justice and development, we must understand that we cannot pursue growth policies indefinitely. In other words, that there are real, finite, ecological limits to growth. Do you agree with that?
Up to a point, but the qualification matters. A great friend, David Attenborough, said that the only people who think that growth can go on indefinitely are idiots and economists. But he said indefinitely. David chose his words carefully. I'm talking about the next 30 or 40 years. And the key thing is to break the relationship between our economic activity and the damage we do to the environment. Suppose we stopped growth right now, absolutely. I mean, we couldn't, but suppose we did, just for the sake of this argument and the question that you've asked. We're emitting 50 billion tons CO2 equivalent a year. We've got to get a balance between sources and sinks within 50 years. We've got to cut that by 20% in 20 years. Suppose you stop growth right now, and that was the major plank in your policy. It absolutely wouldn't perform. You'd be in deep trouble. So stopping growth doesn't deliver what we need. What delivers what we need is breaking the relationship between our economic activity and the damage that it does. So I would prefer to focus attention exactly on that point, because that's what we need to do. And the story that you've got to stop growth to do this torpedoes the politics, and it's actually not right, because stopping growth just wouldn't do it. So that's why I said up to a point. But David Attenborough said forever, I'm not talking about forever. I'm talking about how we can change the next 30 or 40 years to make it much more attractive and much more responsible. So I think that's where we should focus our attention. You remember Woody Allen on Infinity? It's a very long time, particularly near the end. I'm talking about the next 30 or 40 years. And getting that right is in our hands. And we can't be diverted by that kind of argument, I don't think.
Gentleman just there.
Thank you very much for the lecture again. Can a critical mass of countries experiencing populism create sufficient defectors to derail the type of international initiatives you've discussed?
I mean, the abstract answer to that question, there must be a number for which that's true, right? So the question is, would it be likely to get there? Well, you've got to start by looking at the big ones. I've worked for more than 40 years in India, more than 30 years in China. And the way those countries have changed in the recent past is quite extraordinary. China's emissions have probably plateaued. We don't know for sure. China promised to peak its emissions by 2030. They've probably plateaued already. They'll bounce around. There'll be periods probably when they go up a bit, and other periods when they go down a bit. And we hope that in the 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 25, that they will really start to go down. So I'm trying to answer your question by looking at the big places. And China really has changed. I mean, they really got it about 6 years ago. It's very interesting to look at the path of China's emissions. Just around Copenhagen, they started to decelerate. And just around Paris, they started to plateau. They really take it seriously, and they really take it seriously for good reason. Climate change is about water. They worry like mad about water. It's about, we've seen the connection with air pollution. They really worry about that. They see a technological race and the big growth story, and they rather fancy themselves to do well in that, and good luck to them. So the reasons for China committing like this are really strong and lasting. Those reasons are building in India. It's had a big effect in India, this incredibly rapid fall in the price of solar energy and wind energy. There's quite a lot of wind in India as well. They'll not complete the coal-fired power stations that had been on the planning books in India. So you're seeing in the big, I hope that from this sort of crisis around international relations and trade, that Europe might stand up now. And I gave 5 dimensions on which Europe could really lead, and climate, of course, is one of them. This could transform politically Europe's role in the world if they got it right. And Angela Merkel is pretty good on this stuff. So is Macron. So is the new Prime Minister of Spain. I hate to speculate on what the Italian politics will bring in this area, but we'll find out. But there is a chance, it seems to me, and this government's not been bad on this. Now, the UK has its climate change legislation coming up for 10 years. We have grown our economy by 65-70% since 1990 and cut emissions by 40%. There are some strange members of the House of Lords who don't necessarily see it that way. But that's not the government, that's not the massive body politic. So I've tried to answer your question by looking around the big parts of the world. You know, I did China and India and Europe. And the United States could well meet its Paris obligations through the actions in cities and states and so on, and in business, and through sensible investing. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build coal-fired power stations in the United States, does it? I mean, whatever the predilections of the current occupancy of the White House, that's not forever. And these investments cover a long period of time. So you can't answer your question just in terms of one number. How many countries does it take? You have to look at what's happening in different parts of the world. And there's enough to build on. It's not happening anywhere near as fast as we need. Don't get me wrong. But there's something there in terms of momentum that allows us to say, well, how do we accelerate? How do we build on that? And that's the question, it seems to me.
Thank you very much, Your Lordship, for your presentation. A while ago, you underscored the troubling nature of the of the relations between the US and mainland Europe, the UK included. It's really been a long time since we've seen these relations this distant. If we go back to the IMF, Dexter White and Maynard Keynes would have been really the focus of the distance that we could see in, say, UK-US positions in the global economic order. Today, the US and the UK and Europe in general disagree a lot. And attention is not really focused on that. If we take, for example, the situation in Iran, the Iranian agreement, which is a clear locus of disagreement between these two important actors of global diplomacy. If we take the Israel-Palestinian issue, if we take even trade relations between the EU and the US, and today with genetically modified organisms, which are a key aspect of the regulatory chapter of the negotiated trade agreement between the US and the EU, which have stalled today, these issues show us that these relations are really troubled. I had a feeling from your presentation that it seems like the EU can tackle global challenges even without the US support. But now, from a more concrete perspective, do you think this is possible? Is it possible for Europe and the UK in particular to really drive global leadership in tackling challenges without the US support? Thank you.
I think my argument was that the major countries of the world, and it's an important challenge that you make, but my argument was that the major countries of the world can get on with it. And the right reaction in these circumstances is to get on with it. The more you show what can be done, the more you show why there's reason to believe it works, the more you show that you can collaborate with other parts of the world, particularly, of course, the two most important countries, which are China and India. This is the way that we should react to the kind of challenge that we now face. And we build our relationships, as I'm sure Bill Fulbright would have done, with the people of the United States. The people of the United States in cities and towns and firms and NGOs are speaking up very strongly. And I mentioned Governor Jerry Brown as a shining example, but I mean, if you look at Walmart and the way in which they treat their supply chains, I mean, there are big examples, which is a rather positive thing. If you look right across the United States, there are people that you can work with and who want to work with you, and they themselves are getting on with it too. So in a time like this, to carry on in action and to carry on collaborating and build something which, when the leadership of the United States changes, has moved on. But at the same time, of course, the United States, in many dimensions, will have moved on as well. I don't want to minimize the difficulties, because it's harder now. But I want to describe what the right reaction, in my view, is, and to build relationships right across the various dimensions I described. I picked the climate change example, but across those other areas as well, like antimicrobial resistance, pandemics, and so on.
One of the aspects about which we can't do anything is sea level rise. Right, it's inexorable over the next 25 years. It will continue to rise at about 3 millimeters a year, possibly faster. Beyond that, it's a little less certain, but it's probably going to continue to accelerate. 1 in 10 people on the planet live in cities that are beside the ocean. Those cities are also subsiding because of groundwater extraction. Do you think that seriously we have the resources to repopulate those cities, to move the infrastructure away from coastal cities inland? I mean, one looks at just what it's cost Venice to try and protect itself against sea level rise. Boston's going to be flooded by 2035. London, unless it actually gets on with its new barrage scheme, will also be flooded in a storm with wave surges well above the current one by 2030. What should we do?
Worry, move inland, but and you have to begin, as you begin, David, by understanding the problem and the challenge, by laying out the kind of numbers we're dealing with, laying out the risks, and making investments which are more resilient. Now, there's no choice. I mean, you can let it happen, and to pursue the analogy, let the waves come over you. But on this one, we have to understand the risks and understand what's involved. But what you're saying is life is going to be more expensive than it would have been had we not built up all this problem for ourselves. I mean, that's your observation. But that's where we are, right? So you're going to have to invest and take into account. As it happens, a lot of the things that we want to do from the point of view of reducing emissions, adapting, building more resilient infrastructure and promoting development, in many cases they come together. If you think of protecting the Sundarbans in the Bay of Bengal, if you act to protect those, you're strengthening the sea defences, you're looking after the fishing industry, you're building the tourism because of the tigers are there. If you look at the system of route intensification for rice, if you excuse me drawing most of my examples from India, but there are plenty of examples from other places. What you do is you change the planting distance and the planting depth. I mean, you know this stuff, but perhaps not everybody does. And it's not necessary to flood the fields. So you don't flood the fields, so you get less methane release from the flooded fields. You save water, you save energy, and it's more robust against difficult weather. So these are Sundarbans, system of route intensification. I mean, it's not just for rice, other crops too. Are examples of the way in which, if we think it through and anticipate and bring the information of the kind you've described to the table, we can understand how to weave together mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and development. A lot of the transport system, I mean, if disasters, strikes, and cyclones and hurricanes happen, the first thing that really matters is the transportation system. How do you move the stuff that you need around? Well, that is sort of investing in a better public transportation system. A lot of this, a more robust one, would help you dealing with the crises when they come along. So the first thing is, well, that's tough. We've messed up and it's going to cost us more. We better understand that. Second is really look at the risks and understand them as best you can. But also be imaginative and find the ways of weaving together, the development story and the mitigation story and the adaptation story.
We'll take one more question, please.
Actually, it could easily come to Oxford, They're in the Crossrail, they've been drilling along and they've got to about where the temperatures might have been 30 or 40 million years ago, and Ruislip was by the seaside. Those of you who don't know Ruislip, you could think of Heathrow as that sort of...
Good evening. My name is John Bader. I'm with the Fulbright Association, and we're delighted to co-sponsor this extraordinary event, so thank you for including us. The partnership between the United States and the UK, as demonstrated through our partnership with the Fulbright, shows that we have a long view of our relationship, and we look forward to a more promising future in that regard. I had a comment and a question. The comment was that Fulbrighters across this planet are standing by to help. We want to work together. We want to share our expertise and bring our energy to problems like the ones that you have been outlining this evening. And I hope that all of the Fulbrighters in this room will remember we have been given a great gift, and it is our job to be engaged and to work together. The question is about the future of energy. It seems to me that if we do not solve the issue of energy and how to do this in a way that is sustainable and green, we're all dead. Can you tell us a little bit more about where thinking is on a global level using these multinational organizations to think about ways how we could work together to come up with multinational investment, other ways of thinking through the problem, harnessing our worldwide engineering community to solve this problem so that we have energy that allows us to live into the next century?
And thank you very much for the carrying on the vision of Bill Fulbright and working to make all these things happen and to help change the way people understand things, the way we understand things. There are a lot of people in the room who know more about the detail of energy than I do. There's one place you can look, which is the work of the Energy Transition Commission. The title sort of tells you what it's trying to do. And they have put out really quite a lot of quite serious work where they're trying to speculate about ways forward. But I think on the power side, we can more or less see where it's going to go. We've made such progress on renewables and on storage that we can see a world where we really don't have to have positive carbon electricity. You can manage the intermittencies with big grid systems and better control, and the cost of wind and solar are going to keep on going down. And in solar, we haven't seen huge technological breakthroughs. We're still using roughly the same silicon-based technologies. Nevertheless, the cost has crashed, and then storage is moving very rapidly. So I'm not saying we know exactly what's going to happen, but I think we can be pretty confident that we can see a future 15 or 20 years away, if we so choose, with most of electricity being zero or close to zero carbon. How fast it happens depends on us and policies and so on. Transport, we can see some of it through electricity and hydrogen. We don't yet know about the aeroplanes, but we're learning. I mean, it seems to me that if we're going to use biofuels, we should stick them in our aeroplanes, not in cars and ships. So we can see some of our way through that. In difficult areas, like steel and cement, there is great activity in trying to find different ways of doing things. And I have a lot of faith that if policy is strong enough and the social and economic incentives are strong enough and the social priorities are strong enough, people will move very quickly. And if you just look at the progress we've seen, as I tried to describe over the last 10 years, in terms of transport, in terms of electricity and so on. Why did it happen? It happened partly through economic incentives, but partly through that this issue had moved very rapidly up through our social priorities. And as soon as HIV/AIDS became recognized, it took far too long, of course, but as soon as it became recognized as a major global issue, which required strong immediate attention, it got it. And it turned out to be, in some ways, a more difficult problem, but it was really mastered. And so I think that the challenge is to keep moving right up the social and economic priorities, these issues, and make sure our universities and so on are well funded to pursue them, and try lots of things. The Japanese are making a big punt on hydrogen for driving long distance vehicles. Well, good. We need the Swansea tidal lagoon. That could work. Although who knows what they might announce in the next week or so. We have to look across the waterfront at these different kinds of ways of doing things and really make lots of experiments on scale. And I think we've seen how fast things can move.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to draw...
And the forests and the oceans and so on. I don't want to be just obsessive about the physical infrastructure.
Okay.
Sorry.
We're going to draw this to a conclusion. And it's been, I think, a somber discussion about incredibly important things. And perhaps we can just focus on 3 of the lessons that at least I took from the questions that you asked and the answers that you gave us. Can we? Yes, we can. Will we? Well, we must do it, because the scale of problems is such that we must find the solutions. Then the big issue is, how do we do it? And I thought that really was the absolute meat of what you were saying in your talk today. And I particularly liked, obviously, the intense importance of process, of getting processes to work, the intense importance of ideas, and the framing of priorities and the framing of issues, and then working out how to put the messages in ways which have traction. And then, of course, as we said with our students earlier in the day, it's about action. People have got to get involved and mobilize in order to achieve these sorts of goals. But I think that you gave, in a somber situation, a terrifically hopeful and optimistic way for us to try and engage with them. So thank you enormously for that. There will be some opportunity to carry on over dinner, but now I suggest we go and lighten the mood by having a glass of something out in the reception hall here. So, but again, Lord Stern, thank you enormously.